let off some steam, Bennett.
Gemini Rue was a point-and-click adventure game published by Wadjet Eye Games, released on PC in 2011, and with 2 mobile ports released a couple of years afterwards. One of the most striking things about the game is how it was programmed, animated, illustrated, written, designed, and directed by one man, programmer Joshua Nuernberger, with Gemini Rue appearing to be his passion project. He seems to have given up on design work not too long after this game came out, with his other projects being a text adventure game called Chat Room, a third-person experiment called Polyphony, and another pixel art point-and-click adventure game and World War II shooter hybrid called La Croix Pan, forgive the pronunciation. These days, he's working on marketing gigs, it looks like, and even was at NASA for a little while, working on propulsion. He's basically the John Carmack of the independent game point-and-click world. Gemini Rue was pretty highly acclaimed when it was released, winning a couple of awards from publications like GameSpot and PC Gamer. And hey, since Wadjet Eye Games isn't a publisher who can afford to purchase review scores and rent a hooker for the critics to run shade on, it's probably legitimate. Now that there's some distance between us and the initial release of the game, let's give it a look and see how it holds up. In Gemini Rue, the player takes control of 2 protagonists, Azrael Odin and Delta 6, in 2 branching plot lines while swapping between the 2. The game attempts to capture the feel of older LucasArts adventure games, retaining the pixel art style and puzzle-driven gameplay, but also tries to streamline some aspects and add some unique mechanics to set it out from the competition. Of course, you go through the traditional motions of moving a cursor around the screen and clicking to move your character from point to point, with challenges focused around collecting an inventory of objects to solve puzzles with, and gathering information by talking to characters. Getting to the things that make Gemini Rue unique, the player can interact with the world in 4 different ways. They can observe something, represented by the eye symbol, they can interact with it, represented by the hand symbol, they can speak with it, represented by the text bubble symbol, or they can do a Duke Nukem style mighty boot attack, or simply just get a foothold onto something, represented by the boot symbol. Gemini Rue has a neat utility feature in relation to these 4 interaction methods, where if the player manually selects one of the 4 from the menu, they can keep using that one by simply double clicking on an object. For the most part, this is pretty useful. Using the hand symbol once and interacting with everything before having to switch up is pretty convenient, but there is a nitpick I have with it. It's convenient until you have to switch up your method of interaction. If you have to look at an object, talk to a guy, step up on a ledge, then interact with something, you have to do it all manually if you do it in some sequential order like that. This isn't an actual issue really. I'm just being a pedantic bitch boy right now. But a part of me has to wonder if it wouldn't have been easier for the double click to activate the method of interaction which would have best fit the object you're clicking. For instance, if I'm clicking on a ledge whose only real function is to step on it, why can't my character just automatically step on it? Again, this is incredibly minor, but it did stick out to me. Talking to characters, getting information out of them, choosing a handful of dialogue options, and telling the truth or lying to the objective of the conversation is one of the most prevalent mechanics of the game. This makes sense considering that in both divergent plot lines, Gemini Rue is a mystery story, which we'll explore in a bit when we actually discuss the narrative itself. While the quality of the writing isn't at all an issue, the largest problem that I have with the speaking mechanics is how the dialogue choices really don't matter at all. This isn't as bad as a number of the your choices matter adventure games which have stagnated the genre in the past few years, but giving you so many dialogue options only for them to not really be of any significance is pretty baffling when you consider how often they show up. Hell, this game has 2 endings, slightly different endings, but still 2 different endings, and what activates them has nothing to do with the dialogue choices at all. Oh, and a quick aside about the branching dialogue paths. If you're ever planning on playing Gemini Rue, here's a pro tip. When you get the phone number for a guy named Kenneth from the Gangster Guy, here's the path you want to take. Call Kenneth. Say you're calling about a job. Say it's a piloting job. Then say it's enough to go from Taurus and back. If you don't do this, and you do it blind like I did for my first playthrough, you'll exhaust most, if not all of his dialogue choices, and each time you fail, you'll be booted out of the conversation and will have to repeat the phone call process from the ground up. Trust me, you'll want to skip this. How Gemini Rue tackles its puzzles is one of my favorite aspects of the game, because rather than featuring the traditional nonsensical rub this object on this part of the environment challenges, you'll do more common sense tasks. For instance, how do I break into this apartment? I'll pick the lock. Well, the lock's electronic. I'll pick into the neighboring apartment and I'll walk across the balcony. How do I break into the patio door? I smack it with a pipe. Pipe is stuck. I kick it in and I get myself in that way. This is just one example of the types of puzzles present in Gemini Rue, and it is a welcome addition to the game. And unlike the dialogue system, there really isn't any negative examples I'd feel the need to explain, as the game provides enough in-context information to easily work yourself through it. They're interesting, simple, don't overstay their welcome, and keep you engrossed in the world. When talking about the gameplay mechanics in Gemini Rue, the biggest elephant in the room is definitely the gun combat in the game. It's pretty much the universal criticism with the game. I'd wager that every single detailed review has mentioned it at some point. Before giving my own stance on the matter, I'd just like to highlight once again that this was one guy behind the majority of the game, and how much I respect his attempt to add more gameplay into this video game, even if Gemini Rue still is a narrative-driven experience. The actual combat, it's not bad, but it's by no means what I would call good either. Gunfights start with the player immediately going into cover and being able to pop in and out of it. You pop out of the left side of the A key and the right side of the D key. When multiple enemies are in the fray, you can switch between two targets with W, reload with R, shoot with space, and then hit control to enter into the breathing mechanic. The breathing meter is a rising notch that, once in the green zone, allows the player to do an instant kill headshot, as long as the enemy is out of cover, of course. It's great for one-on-one encounters, but when there are two guys attacking at once, I wouldn't say it's that viable. While I don't enjoy the combat, to be frank, I do respect Nuernberger for trying to add some variety to the gameplay, and the gunfights only happen at points in the story where they would make sense. For the most part. The last major mechanic to discuss is the teleport the player has. When walking between 2 points, you can press escape to skip the walking animation in between. It's a small addition, but it is a welcome one. For whatever reason though, the game is pretty inconsistent with when you can use this. For instance, when double clicking on an interactive object, sometimes you can't use the time skip, and other times you can. Why? No real reason on surface level. And after a certain point in the story, the ability to warp is taken away from the player. But for the time you have it, and when it works, it's pretty helpful. Well, that pretty much covers it in terms of gameplay, so let's look at what surrounds the core experience. The game's environments are made from over 60 hand-drawn environments, as told to me by the Steam page, and while I initially thought the game was a little small in scope on my first playthrough, my attitude changed when I learned the details of development. I mean, hey, 60 hand-drawn environments by one guy for one game on top of everything else he was doing? That's impressive. Within the scope of Gemini Rue, backgrounds are well detailed, and when paired with the game's decent, possibly public domain sound design, it can be fairly atmospheric. The Azrael sections within the rain are pretty noir-tinged. I enjoy it. The pixel art is nice too. The character models really do capture that early 90s adventure game feel, and they actually remind me a fair bit of the character sprites from Beneath the Steel Sky, no doubt an inspiration on Gemini Rue. The character profiles are decently drawn, and the in-game models are well differentiated from one another. While I'm by no means a music buff, I can safely say that I enjoyed the soundtrack to Gemini Rue. The noir-tinged Azrael sections of the game have an appropriately slow, dark jazz vibe, and the Delta 6 segments have a somewhat eerie ambient track going through all of them. They do a good job of keeping the player on edge. So yeah, the music is pretty good. When the music actually plays, because for reasons completely out of my grasp, the game simply stops playing the background music for large stretches at a time, leaving you to play the majority of the game without any soundtrack whatsoever. The music isn't repetitive at all either, so I see no harm in playing it on loop. Although at least the music itself is decent, and I'd rather have this issue than terrible tracks being played on loop. And for an independent game, the voice acting in Gemini Rue is pretty solid overall. They all fit their characters, and can moan enough to convincingly express what they're thinking and feeling in a given moment. No performance really stood out to me, but none I would outright call bad. Well, maybe the faux Boston accent of one of the other patients alongside Delta 6, but the voice actor plays more than one character, so it's definitely tolerable. Alright, just a quick note to let you know, this is where we get into the story section of this review, so if you want to go into Gemini Rue completely blind, I'd recommend turning away right now. To give a quick overview of the game's plot, Gemini Rue takes place in a space future where, after a massive interplanetary system war, the Gemini star system declared independence from its two contemporaries, the Taurus and Pleiades star systems. Unfortunately for those stuck inside of the Gemini star system, it's run by the triad or Yakuza-esque mob calling itself the Boryokuden instead of the type of mob that we're all familiar with living under. The Boryokuden have had a chokehold on the day-to-day activities of Gemini for about a decade when the game takes place, and run leverage over citizens under them through good old-fashioned intimidation tactics and prevalent addiction to a future heroin called juice, which has resulted in a silent epidemic of addiction. just like in the real world of the 21st century. One of their methods of hiring staff, if you can call it that, is through the repurposing of old POW camps to recondition undesirables into becoming valuable assets to them, such as hackers or hitmen. It's vaguely similar to the prison system in A Clockwork Orange, and this isn't going to be the last time you hear me make some lazy allusion to another similar piece of media. What might very well be the last of these super prisons is called Sector 7, and it's what the two plot lines of Gemini Rue revolve themselves around. One of these stories follows a man named Azrael Odin. Yes, that is a ridiculous name. A former hitman turned cop. Yes, that is a ridiculous backstory, but we'll get to why it works later. Azrael finds himself on the Gemini planet of Barracus in search of an old pal from the war named Matthias Howard, who may have knowledge on the whereabouts of Azrael's brother Daniel. On his investigation, Azrael finds himself up against the Boryokun, hanging out with bums, and committing numerous home invasions to find out more of the enigmatic Sector 7. On the flip side of this, we have a Sector 7 prisoner named Delta 6, forcefully confined to the facility after having his memory just wiped from a previous failed escape attempt. You see, Sector 7 conditioning involves wiping the memories of the inmates and giving them new implanted memories and identities upon completion of their training, to better condition them for their future careers as criminals, and to hide information they might have on Sector 7. In essence, turning them into the perfect killing machines, as our protagonist Delta 6 is being trained in the handling of firearms and gunfights, presumably for assassination. Sector 7 and its business of forcefully confining, training, reconditioning, and eventually mind-wiping its assets to become criminal agents, primarily hitmen, reminds me of an amalgam of plenty of different science fiction pieces. The first thing to come to mind would be the Manchurian Candidate, of course, but the bit about memory implants is a concept very much in the Philip K. Dick playhouse, particularly in the short story, We'll Remember It For You, Wholesale. And the entire situation of a shadowy organization mind-wiping assets before sending them loose on the world has me recalling what happened to the Case 53s in Worm, a web serial, by John C. McCrae, better known by the handle Wildbow. What makes Sector 7 interesting, though, is how it could be compared to other science fiction sources while still being unique in its own concept, and how it tackles memory leads to what I find to be the most interesting theme of Gemini Rue, which we'll get to later. Back to the game, Delta 6 once again finds himself wrapped up in a paranoid web of misdirection as he tries to begin from where he left off to escape the facility, unaware of who he can trust and who is manipulating him. Professional tip: who you can't trust is insanely obvious, and that makes this aspect of the story incredibly weak. As one would expect in a narrative told with two different plot lines to follow, the stories of Azrael and Delta 6 converge in the game's final act, and altogether the complete package makes for a fairly interesting science fiction narrative. The characters are reasonably defined, the story takes twists and turns which are well telegraphed without being too obvious, for the most part, and some of the ideas it explores are actually pretty unique. I haven't seen the idea of memory explored in a narrative this way before, but that could simply be due to my own status as a brainlet. Overall, I enjoyed the story of Gemini Rue, and if that's all you want to hear, then skip to this point of the video or just stop watching altogether. From here on out, I discuss the real spoilers. The real focal point of the theme of Gemini Rue is the game's twist, revealed in the final act. Azrael Odin makes his way into Sector 7, alongside Sayuri, also known as Epsilon 5, an escapee from the facility, to find Daniel, and they encounter the aloof director of Sector 7. The director then proceeds to drop the plot's largest bombshell onto the player. Daniel Odin isn't real, and was just an implanted memory put into Azrael, who himself was also not traditionally real. And this is because Azrael Odin is Delta 6. While the twist isn't exactly mind-blowing, it's executed well, and the second playthrough of a game reveals how interesting the chronology of events really are. The game is told out of order, with the linear progression being Delta 6's segments, followed by the introduction of the game, and then ending with the Azrael side of things. You see, Azrael Odin's absurd name and absurd backstory are selected by the eccentric director, and Azrael himself was just a programmed killer given by Sector 7 to the Boryokuden. For whatever reason though, Azrael backed out due to some sense of morality which wasn't part of the programming, and became a cop afterwards. Due to this product error, his fake implanted memory of a missing brother brought him back to Sector 7, as an insurance policy pretty much. Why did Azrael have that change of heart to begin with? The director speculates that it had something to do with his conscience, which is resistant to the memory wiping conditioning of Sector 7. But honestly, I have a really hard time buying this explanation. How Gemini Rue tackles its themes is actually one of the more interesting things about the narrative, because the majority of the game seems to have the idea of our memories being what define us as people, and with them gone, we're entirely new individuals. Essentially, if our memories were wiped like the victims of Sector 7, it might as well be a death sentence. This is highlighted in a conversation between Delta 6 and one of the other inmates attempting to escape named Giselle, who may have set Delta 6 up to get mind wiped in his first escape attempt. The conversation goes like this. In Giselle's words, "Don't you know what this place is? It's a rehab center for criminals. That means that they wipe your brain when you get in, and they wipe your brain when you get out. I don't know about you, but I'm not ready to lose my identity again, after already losing it once. This conscience is the only one I have, and I'm not going to let some other person decide who I am, what I've done, and what I act like. Even if I live out of this place, it's the same as being dead to me if I don't know." The real edge to this conversation is through Delta 6's only available response to this. "But I had my memory wiped to help you." Giselle's answer to this? "But you're still the same person as before, you still have all the same people to remind you." Almost as if she's saying others are deciding who he is, what he's done, and what he acts like. It really makes you think. At this point, my mind was racing with questions and potential themes to explore. Is who we are really defined by ourselves or by others? If both are valid, do we even have any true self, or simply conditioned responses to different stimuli in certain situations? Are we, as in we as individuals, really nothing more than just our memories? And if we lose our memories, have we essentially died? That memory science stuff is genuinely terrifying in this example, because according to a Northwestern medicine study, not only do you not actually remember original events in your life, instead remembering just the last time you remembered it, but your memories of the past are basically edited by your emotions on said topic in the present. And considering that emotions are the chemical responses in one's mind to external happenings, it's actually pretty unnerving to think just how unreliable our memories really are. In relation to how this reflects on the characters, when Giselle says that Delta 6 is still the same person, the sad truth of it is that he isn't. Our protagonist to Gemini Rue, whether he's called Azrael or Delta 6, is just a bastardized replacement of the original man, who in a bit of inspired writing we never learn anything about. The rough timeline of events seems to suggest that there was an original man who was mind-wiped to become Delta 6, who was then mind-wiped to become Delta 6 II, who we play as, who is then mind-wiped to become Delta 6 III, the process of which we see in the game's opening, who himself was mind-wiped to become Azrael Odin. So yeah, the memory topic was pretty well done. For the most part, until the game's ending. In the game's final act, when Azrael 6 gets his mind wiped once again and rescued by his partner and Sayuri/Epsilon 5, Sayuri sets out to destroy Sector 7 once and for all. She causes a reactor meltdown, which in response to this catastrophic system failure releases all of the security locked doors of the prison. She uses this opportunity to get into the director's office, and while attempting to get her memory back, she's confronted by the man at gunpoint. He then goes on about some predestination ideas, and then the control switches back to the once again mind-wiped Azrael 6, who goes to try and rescue Sayuri, or Epsilon 5, whatever you prefer at this point. He gets into the office, watches the director shoot Sayuri, or Epsilon 5, shoots him, and the player can then choose which ending they receive, though it only changes the immediate cutscene. You can choose to either go to the wounded Sayuri and have a quick chat before leaving, or you can go to the director's computer in an attempt to get Azrael 6's full memory back, which triggers another conversation. While both resulting in the same conclusion, I prefer the latter of the two options outlined by a wide margin, which I'll explain in a moment. The actual ending is Sayuri talking to Azrael's partner, the three having escaped and destroyed Sector 7, about how we're more than just our memories, and how Azrael 6 is totally the same person as before, don't worry about it. Initially, I was incredibly opposed to this ending for a few reasons. It's not exactly a scientific idea in this science fiction game, and cyberpunk in particular is tied to ideas of maintaining humanity in the face of great technological advancement, or if keeping our humanity is even all that important in the face of said advancement. Sayuri's little speech about all but spells out the idea that he has a soul, which regardless of my personal beliefs towards religion and spirituality, I personally just don't think really belongs in a piece of cyberpunk fiction like Gemini Rue. I don't know, it feels out of place. However, there's a more reasonable explanation for Azrael's lapse from assassin work, and that comes from the form of one of the other Sector 7 inmates, called Beta 2 or Balder. Or, as we see him for a large chunk of the game's story, Matthias Howard. Simply put, the inmates of Sector 7 and Boulder in particular demonstrate how the memory wipe is itself not actually a full erase. When Delta 6 first had his memory wiped, Boulder was the obviously nefarious one trying to manipulate him to get his revenge, when pre-story wipe Delta 6 prevented him from holding hands at Epsilon 5 without her consent. After that plan fails and you get him to let off some steam, Boulder himself gets mind wiped, seemingly forgetting everything about his grudge against Delta 6. However, he doesn't actually forget. He doesn't exactly remember, but he clearly can recall his true feelings towards Delta 6 and the other escapees, as he demonstrates when hunting them down on the director's orders during their second botched escape attempt. He remembers his pure hate for these people after killing Giselle and wounding Delta 6, which is something even the director comments on. Even in the game's final act, when Baldur and Matthias are revealed to be one and the same, he fixates on his hate for Delta 6, now Azrael Odin before him, even spouting one of his older catchphrases during Odin's final mind wipe. However, we can tell he doesn't actually remember the events of the game's Delta 6 chapter due to the language he uses when confronting Azrael 6 about their past. He describes their history in vague terms, about how he heard about it rather than coming across as if he truly recalled the events, but it's irrelevant. The hate's all the same. And let's not forget, apparently, your emotions overwrite your memories. At least, to some degree. It's also worth noting at this point how the Sector 7 prisoners still have their memories of how to speak, and in particular how to do their basic training tasks, be it hacking or shooting, which means that the memory wipes actually cannot be all-encompassing. Remember when I said I preferred the slight change in the ending where Azrael 6 tries to recover his memory? Well, there is a reason for that, so let's get into it. In this slight branch, when Azrael tries going for the computer to learn who he and Sayuri were, he stops by none other than Sayuri, as best as she can stop him at that very moment. She says that she doesn't need to know who she was, and that Azrael 6 doesn't need to know who he was either. No real justification is given for her idea, since he just takes it at face value, and they escape. The ending cutscene plays as usual, where Sayuri goes on her little speech about being more than just memories, but this time around it's a tad more interesting. Think about it. Like Giselle said, Azrael 6's person and past have been decided on by someone else. But in this ending, it's Sayuri who just defined him. Think about it. Telling someone directly that they don't need to know who they were is in its own way defining their past and their personality. In this light, both her and the director's musings about being more than our memories, and how the conscience cannot be overwritten, come across more as hasty justifications for two people trying to validate their actions. And as we established with Baldur and the abilities of the Sector 7 inmates in general, the memories of Azrael 6 may have been severely impaired and damaged. However, as he still demonstrates his abilities to successfully engage in a gunfight and his desire to save Sayuri, he still has vague sensations of who he was, albeit not full recollections. It can't be a coincidence that he actually thinks putting his ass on a line for a woman he has only known for about 5 minutes after getting his mind wiped would be a good idea. While his memories may be damaged, may be broken, almost beyond repair, they still are there and he does deserve to know who he was. So in the end, Sayuri's justification of saying that people are more than just their memories is mostly false, and simply might be the sad self-delusions of someone who doesn't want to come to terms with the fact that she basically just killed off whoever Azrael 6 was permanently. Or maybe I'm completely wrong and I'm just talking out of my ass. Overall, I enjoy Gemini Rue a good deal. While it does have its shortcomings, it has a good narrative, memorable characters, and explores some interesting ideas and scenarios. The best standout gameplay mechanic would have to be its use of common sense puzzles, while issues such as the clunky combat and the occasional functional inconsistency with the interaction drag the experience down just a smidge. Gemini Rue isn't an all-time favorite or anything, but it's a damn fine little game which I can easily recommend to any fan of point-and-click titles.